Three words, "You're mine now," spoken by a farm boy to a dying woman behind barbed wire in 1945. It sounded like ownership, but it was a vow that would take 5 years, four rejected petitions, and a change in federal law to keep. By the time they finally stood in a chapel in Honolulu, the question wasn't whether they'd survive the war, it was whether they'd survive the peace. Before we dive into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Every view helps bring more stories like this to life. The summer of 1945 came to Honouliuli without mercy. The camp sprawled across a gulch of red volcanic dirt and relentless sun, barbed wire splitting the hillside into rectangles of barracks, laundry lines, and watchtowers. The war was ending in increments, surrender announcements, ceasefire orders, ships carrying soldiers home, but peace moved slower than rumor. In the compounds, hundreds waited. Japanese prisoners of war in one section, civilian internees in another. The counted were fed. The overlooked went hungry. Sae Aragusuku was 19 years old. Before the war found her, she had lived in a fishing village on Okinawa's southern coast where her father mended nets and her mother sold vegetables at the morning market. Her younger sister had been learning to weave baskets. Her older brother had worked the family's small taro patch. In April 1945, the battle came. Her family fled to a cave in the limestone hills. Marines arrived with interpreters and white flags. Sae and 100 others were led out, processed, and loaded onto a transport ship. She never saw her mother again. By the time she reached Oahu and the gates of Honouliuli closed behind her, she had become a number in a ledger, a name on a roster, a body in a barracks. The camp operated under strict rules. No fraternization between guards and detainees. Rations distributed on schedule. Roll call twice daily, but rules were paper and paper tore. Delays happened. Shipments arrived short. People too ashamed or too tired asked only once. Hunger, Say learned, was patient. It waited in the margins. By late August, she had grown lightheaded during the afternoon heat. The portions, rice, a thin soup, occasionally fish, kept her alive but not much more. On a Thursday, she could not later name, she found herself near the quartermaster's hut watching soldiers unload crates. Barley had spilled from a torn sack. The grains glittered in the dirt like scattered gold. She waited until the soldiers moved away, then knelt and began gathering what she could into a tin cup. That's when Private First Class Thomas Merritt saw her. Tom was 23 years old, from a farm outside Veneta, Oklahoma, where his family had survived the Dust Bowl by luck and stubbornness. The Army had given him boots, 3 meals, and a job moving supplies from depot to camp. He knew hunger when he saw it, not the kind that made you skip breakfast, the kind that made your hands tremble before they reached for anything solid. He watched her for maybe 30 seconds. She moved slowly, carefully, as if performing a ritual, then she swayed. The cup slipped from her fingers. Her knees buckled. Tom moved fast. He caught her under the arms before her head hit the gravel. She weighed almost nothing. Her pulse fluttered against his wrist like something trapped. Without thinking, he said the words that would bind them across wire and years and an ocean of paperwork. "You're mine now." She didn't understand English, but she heard the tone, not threat, not transaction, something closer to an oath. Tom half carried her to the shade of the quartermaster's hut and yelled for the medic. Corporal Hayes arrived with his kit, checked her pulse, lifted her eyelids. "Heat exhaustion," he said. "Dehydration, probable malnutrition." He looked at Tom. "She in your section?" "No," Tom admitted. Hayes raised an eyebrow, but didn't push it. He left a canteen and a packet of electrolyte powder. "Get her to drink. Slowly. I'll note it in the log as a civilian medical call." After Hayes left, Tom sat with her in the shade. She drank the water in small, careful sips. He pulled a D-ration chocolate bar from his jacket. Standard issue, 4 ounces. Soldiers complained it tasted like sweetened dirt. And unwrapped it. He broke off a piece and held it out. Sai stared at the chocolate. She had not seen real sugar in months. Her hand moved slowly, as if testing whether the offer was real. When her fingers closed around the piece, it felt impossibly heavy, impossibly rich. She ate it in tiny bites, eyes closed, tears sliding down her cheeks. Tom gave her the rest of the bar. Then he stood, said something in English she couldn't parse, and walked back toward the depot. That evening, in the mess tent, Tom told his friend, Corporal Daniel Diaz, what had happened. Diaz was Signal Corps, good with languages, skeptical about most things, but practical about the rest. You gave her your ration, Diaz said. It wasn't a question. She was starving. They're all hungry, Tom. You can't fix the whole camp. I know, but Tom couldn't stop thinking about her. Something in the way she'd moved, not frantic, not desperate, but methodical, digging in the dirt with the same care someone might use to search for something precious. She had been someone before the war hollowed her out. He could see it in her posture, even kneeling in the dust. The next morning, he went back to the compound fence. She was there, sitting in the shade of the barracks, hands folded in her lap. He brought more rations. This time she didn't hesitate. She took them and ate while he watched. He tried speaking slowly in English, but she only shook her head. On Sunday, an interpreter came through, a civilian volunteer from Honolulu who spoke both Japanese and English. Through him, Tom learned her name, Sai, from Okinawa, family lost, alone. The interpreter, an older man named Mr. Tanaka, explained that many of the Okinawan internees had fallen through the cracks of the system. They weren't enemy soldiers. They weren't even from mainland Japan. They were civilians caught in the last brutal push of the Pacific Campaign, displaced and detained because no one knew what else to do with them. Tom made a decision that could have gotten him court-martialed. He started bringing safe food every day, not just rations, real food from the mess. Bread, eggs, sometimes soup in a thermos he borrowed and returned before anyone noticed. He would find her by the fence, hand the food through the wire, then leave before the guards could ask questions. Slowly, she began to recover. Her face filled out. Color returned to her skin. But more than physical recovery, something else was happening between them. A language neither could speak but both understood. Quick reminder before we start. Subscribing helps the channel grow and keeps more stories coming your way. By September, she had learned a handful of English words. He had learned 2 phrases in Japanese taught by Diaz, who had a manual from Signals. Watashi wa anata o mamoru. I will protect you. When Tom said it aloud for the first time, carefully shaping the unfamiliar syllables, Sae laughed, then cried. The word mamoru, Diaz had warned him, meant both to protect and to encircle like a fence. It could mean shelter or cage, depending on what stood outside. One evening in late September, after Tom had passed her a thermos of chicken broth and a roll wrapped in a napkin, Say spoke to him in halting, hard-won English. Why? She asked. Why you help me? Tom was quiet for a long moment. The sun was setting behind the watchtower, painting the gulch in shades of red and gold. He thought about his mother's kitchen in Oklahoma, how she had fed anyone who showed up during the Depression, neighbors who'd lost their farms, drifters riding the rails, children whose parents couldn't stretch the week's rations. His mother used to say hunger wasn't something you debated. You just answered it. He looked at Say through the wire. This woman who had survived a cave and a battle and an ocean crossing and a detention camp, who still moved with the careful grace of someone who'd once had a life worth living. Because, he said slowly, you're mine now. This time she understood, not ownership, obligation, the kind you choose. She reached through the fence and touched his hand, just for a second, before the guard's boots crunched on the gravel and Tom stepped back into regulation distance. But the wire between them had already become something else. Not a barrier, a seam. To understand how a farm boy from Oklahoma and a fisherman's daughter from Okinawa came to stand on opposite sides of a fence in a Hawaiian gulch, making promises in broken syllables, you have to go back further, to dust storms and taro patches, to the lives they'd lived before the war erased the borders of the world. The infirmary soup line became Say's lifeline. Twice a day, she stood with the other women marked for medical rations, a tin cup in hand, waiting for the ladle to scrape the bottom of the pot. The broth was thin, more salt than substance, but it was something. Her body, which had felt like paper stretched over wire, began to remember what hunger without panic felt like. She could stand for morning roll call without swaying. She could walk to the latrines without leaning on the barracks wall, but recovery brought memory. At night, lying on her cot in the crowded barracks, Sai would close her eyes and be back in the cave. The smell of damp limestone, the sound of her mother's breathing in the dark. Artillery fire rolling across the hills like thunder that never stopped. They had lived in that cave for 3 weeks. Her mother, her sister, two neighbor families, an old man who prayed constantly in a dialect Say barely understood. They ate what they'd carried in: pickled vegetables, dried fish, a single bag of rice that disappeared in days. Then the voices outside, foreign, sharp, amplified through metal. White flags pushed into the cave mouth by someone's trembling hand. Her mother had gripped Say's wrist so hard it bruised. "Stay close," she'd said. "No matter what, stay close." But close hadn't been enough. The Marines separated them at the processing point. Women to one side, men to another, children screaming, names shouted across the crowd. Say had looked back once and seen her mother's hand raised, reaching. Then the line moved, and her mother disappeared into a sea of faces Say would spend the rest of her life searching for, in dreams. Now in Honouliuli, Sai watched the American soldier from a distance. He came by the fence most mornings, always with something in his pockets. Bread wrapped in cloth, an apple, once, a hard-boiled egg still warm. He would hand it through the wire to whoever was nearby and trusted enough to pass it to her. He never stayed long. The guards watched everything. Sai didn't know what to make of him. Pity, maybe, or obligation. He had said, "You're mine now," and she turned those words over in her mind like stones, trying to read them from every angle. In her language, to be someone's meant being claimed, yes, but also being cared for. The thing you claimed also claimed you. Did he understand that? Or had he just said words that sounded protective in the moment, the way men did when they wanted to feel useful? She wanted to believe him. That was the dangerous part. Sergeant Klein caught Tom by the quartermaster's hut on a Tuesday morning, voice low but cutting. "Merritt, I see you hovering near the fence again, and I'll have you reassigned to latrine detail for a month." "You read the posted orders?" "Yes, Sergeant." "Then act like it. Non-fraternization means non-fraternization. I don't care if she's starving or sprouting wings." "Not your problem." "Understood, Sergeant." Klein walked away, boots grinding the red dirt. Tom stood there, jaw tight, hands curled into fists at his sides. He'd read the orders. Hell, they were posted on every building in camp. No personal relationships with detainees, no unauthorized aid. No exceptions. He ignored them anyway. That evening, Corporal Diaz found Tom sitting outside the mess tent, staring at a scrap of paper covered in unfamiliar characters. "What's that?" Diaz asked, sitting down beside him. "Japanese," Tom said. "Borrowed a phrasebook from Signals. Thought I'd learn something useful." Diaz took the paper, squinted at it, then laughed. "You're trying to read this? Tom, half these characters are Chinese. You need the spoken stuff, not the written." "Then teach me." Diaz looked at him for a long moment. "You're serious about this girl?" "I'm serious about not letting her starve." "That's not what I asked." Tom didn't answer. Diaz sighed, pulled out his own notebook, a battered Signal Corps manual with phonetic guides scribbled in the margins. "All right, repeat after me. Watashi wa anata o mamoru." Tom stumbled through it twice before the sounds felt close to right. "What's it mean?" "I will protect you," Diaz said. Then he grinned. Though mamoru's a tricky word. Means protect, but also encircle. Like a fence. So you're either promising safety or admitting you're part of the cage. Language is funny that way. Tom repeated the phrase under his breath until it stuck. Inside the women's compound, Say replayed the American's words for the 100th time. "You're mine now." She'd heard possession in his voice, but also something softer. Responsibility, maybe. The way her father used to talk about the fishing nets. They were his to mend, his to care for, his to bring home intact. But her father had also owned those nets. Where did care end and control begin? On Thursday, a guard handed Say a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "From the quartermaster," the guard said, neutral-faced, and walked away before she could ask questions. Inside, a field dressing, clean and folded, and a tin of foot powder. Her feet had been blistered for weeks, raw skin from walking the rocky compound paths in shoes held together by wire and hope. She sat on her cot that night, applied the powder, wrapped the dressing around her heel, and felt something close to gratitude crack open in her chest. He'd noticed, he'd cared, he'd found a way to help that wouldn't get him in trouble. Sunday brought the interpreter. Mr. Tanaka was a retired schoolteacher from Honolulu, a man in his 60s who volunteered at the camp to help internees navigate the bureaucracy of detention. He found Sei by the fence, where Tom stood on the other side, waiting. "He wants to know your name," Mr. Tanaka said in Japanese. "Sei," she said quietly. "Sei Aragusuku, from Okinawa." Mr. Tanaka translated. The American nodded, then spoke. "His name is Thomas Merritt," Mr. Tanaka said. "He's from Oklahoma. He wants to know if the foot powder helped." Sei looked down, then nodded. "He says he'll bring more if you need it." "Why?" Sei asked. "Why does he help me?" Mr. Tanaka translated the question. The American, Thomas, was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke, and Mr. Tanaka's voice softened as he relayed the words. "He says his mother used to feed people during hard times, neighbors, strangers, anyone. She taught him that hunger isn't something you debate. You just answer it." Sei met Thomas's eyes through the wire. He looked tired, sunburned, younger than she'd first thought, maybe only a few years older than her. He smiled, small, uncertain, and she found herself smiling back. It was the first real conversation they'd had. A handful of translated sentences, but it was enough to shift the wire between them from barrier to boundary, the kind you could lean against without disappearing. That night, in the guards' barracks, Sergeant Klein poured himself a cup of coffee and muttered to no one in particular. "That Merritt kid's going to be a problem." Across the compound, the watchtower's searchlight swept the fence line, catching Tom's shadow as he walked back toward the depot. Rumors were already spreading. The farm boy and the Okinawan girl, gifts through the wire, trouble waiting to bloom. But trouble, like hunger, was patient. Sai ate regularly now. The infirmary soup line, the standard rations, the occasional supplement, Tom managed to slip through approved channels. Her body remembered how to hold weight. Her hands stopped shaking when she reached for things, but recovery was slow, and she wasn't alone in her struggle. The camp held over 400 internees, and the bureaucracy moved like honey in winter. Names were misspelled, records lost, rations meant for one compound ended up in another. People fell through the cracks daily, and no amount of posted schedules could catch them all. Then Tom disappeared. For 3 days, Sei didn't see him by the fence. No bread wrapped in cloth. No quiet nod from across the wire. On the 4th day, she asked one of the other women, a middle-aged teacher from Hilo who spoke better English, to inquire with the guards. "Reassigned," the guard said. "Different compound." That's all I know. Sei felt the news like a stone dropping into still water. Reassigned could mean anything. Another part of the camp. Another island. The war was ending in pieces. Soldiers were being rotated, sent home, redistributed. She had no claim on him, no right to expect him to return. He had fed her, kept her alive, and now he was gone. That was how the world worked. People helped when they could, then moved on. She told herself it was better this way, safer. The guards had started watching her too closely. Sergeant Klein's eyes followed her during roll call. Attachment was dangerous in a place built on separation. But at dusk, on the 5th day, she found herself walking toward the fence line anyway. The sun was setting behind the watchtower, painting the gulch in shades of copper and shadow. Most of the other internees had gone inside for the evening meal. The compound was quiet except for the distant clatter of mess kits and the low hum of a generator. Sai stood by the wire, hands wrapped around the chain links, and stared out at the red dirt roads that led away from Honolulu. She didn't know what she was waiting for. Permission to grieve maybe, or just a moment alone to admit how much his absence had cost her. Then she heard boots on gravel. Tom appeared on the opposite side of the fence, slightly out of breath, dirt on his uniform like he'd been running. He stopped when he saw her, and for a moment they just looked at each other through the diamond-shaped gaps in the wire. "Sei," he said, just her name, but it sounded like an apology. She swallowed hard, searching for the English words Diaz had taught her. "You, gone. Reassigned," he said, then slowed down, speaking carefully. Different compound. 3 days. I came back. Why? The question hung between them. Tom stepped closer to the fence, close enough that she could see the sunburn on his neck, the exhaustion in his eyes. Because I told you something, he said, and I need to know if you understood. Sai's heart hammered. She knew what he meant. The words he'd had said when he caught her falling, the words that had kept her awake every night since. You're mine now, she said haltingly, testing the phrase in her mouth like something breakable. Tom nodded. Yeah, that. I need to know. Did it scare you? She thought about how to answer. Her English was too small for the truth, but Mr. Tanaka had taught her a few more phrases over the past weeks, and she cobbled them together as best she could. I not know what it mean, yours, like belong? Not like property, Tom said quickly. He fumbled for the Japanese phrase Diaz had drilled into him. Mamoru, watashi wa anata o mamoru. Protect. The word she'd learned from the Sunday interpreter, but also encircle, Diaz had said. Fence and shelter both. Mamoru, she repeated softly. Then, in Japanese, she asked the question she'd been carrying since that first day. Why me? Tom understood the tone even if the words escaped him. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, woven from thin cord, white and frayed at the edges, parachute cord, the kind used to pack supply drops. He tied it into a ring. He held it up to the fence, threading it through one of the diamond-shaped gaps. Not marriage, he said carefully. Not yet. Laws won't let me. But this? He gestured between them. This is real. You're not alone. I'm not going anywhere. Sei stared at the ring. It was crude, uneven, the knot slightly too large. It was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. She reached through the wire and took it, her fingers brushing his for just a second. The cord was rough against her palm, still warm from his pocket. Mamoru, Tom said again, his voice low and steady. I will protect you, even if they move me again. Even if the paperwork takes years. You're mine and I'm yours. That's what I meant. Sei's vision blurred. She turned away slightly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, not wanting him to see her cry. But Tom stayed where he was, patient, waiting. When she turned back, she slipped the ring onto her finger. It was too large, so she moved it to her thumb. It fit. Anata mo watashi no, she whispered. The phrase Mr. Tanaka had taught her in case she ever needed it. You are mine, too. Tom smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I am. Behind him, boots scraped against gravel, a guard clearing his throat, a warning without words. Tom stepped back from the fence, hands at his sides, regulation distance restored. But the ring stayed on her thumb. Sei watched him walk away, his shadow stretching long across the red dirt. She turned the ring slowly, feeling the rough cord catch against her skin. Belonging, she realized, didn't have to mean being taken. It could mean being chosen by someone, for someone. Mutual and deliberate and small enough to fit through the gaps in a fence. She walked back toward the barracks, lighter than she'd felt in months. The next morning, during roll call, the camp administrator read names from a clipboard. Repatriation list, internees cleared to return to Japan or Okinawa on the next transport ship. Most of the names were men, former soldiers being sent home under the terms of surrender. But near the end of the list, the administrator paused, double-checked the spelling, then called out, Aragusuku Sai. The world narrowed to that single moment. The other women turned to look at her. The guard made a mark on his roster. Sai stood frozen, the parachute cord ring tight around her thumb, and felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. Okinawa. They were sending her back to the rubble and the graves and the caves where her mother's voice had disappeared into smoke. She looked toward the fence, toward the road where Tom had walked away the night before, and realized the wire between them might be the least of the barriers they'd have to cross. Sai didn't sleep the night her name appeared on the repatriation list. She lay on her cot in the crowded barracks, listening to the other women breathe, and tried to imagine returning to Okinawa. The island would be rubble by now. Burned fields, shattered villages, bodies still being pulled from caves. Her family was gone, scattered or dead, she didn't know which. Going back meant starvation without the structure of the camp to catch her. It meant being alone in a place that no longer existed. She twisted the parachute cord ring around her thumb until her skin went numb. By dawn, she'd made a decision. If they forced her onto that ship, she would find a way to disappear before it reached Naha. Better to drown on her own terms than starve slowly on an island of ghosts. Tom found out about the repatriation list from Diaz, who'd overheard it in the admin tent. Aragusuku Sai, Diaz said carefully, watching Tom's face. She's on the next transport, leaves in 3 weeks. Tom didn't say anything. He just stood up, walked out of the mess tent, and kept walking until he reached the camp's administrative building. He waited outside the chaplain's office for 2 hours until Chaplain Robert Ellery finally arrived, keys jingling in his hand. "Private Merritt," Ellery said, surprised. "Something I can help you with?" "Yes, sir." "I need to know how a man can marry a woman who's about to be deported." Ellery's expression shifted from surprise to something closer to pity. He unlocked the door and gestured Tom inside. The chaplain's office was small, neat, filled with paperwork, and a single window overlooking the gulch. Ellery sat behind his desk and folded his hands. "I'm going to assume," he said slowly, "that we're talking about one of the internees." "Yes, sir. And I'm going to assume you understand the regulations against fraternization." "I understand them, sir. I'm asking how to work around them." Ellery sighed and pulled a folder from his desk drawer. "The War Brides Act passed last December. It allows American servicemen to bring foreign spouses into the country under special provisions. But," he opened the folder, running his finger down a page of dense text, "it doesn't apply to Japanese nationals. Not yet. The exclusion laws are still in effect. Congress is debating changes, but that could take months, years even. So there's no way." "I didn't say that." Ellery leaned back in his chair. "I said it's complicated. You need approval from your commanding officer, documentation from the internee, proving she's not a security risk, clearance from military intelligence, and then you'd have to wait for the law to change before she could actually enter the mainland, and all of that assumes she's not deported first." Tom felt the walls of the office pressing in. "What if we delayed the deportation?" "On what grounds?" "Witness testimony, investigation, something." Ellery studied him for a long moment. "You'd be walking a very thin line, Private. If it looks like you're manipulating the system to keep a personal relationship alive, you'll face disciplinary action. Court-martial, possibly." "Noted, sir." The chaplain pulled out a blank form. "There's an inquiry process for civilians who may have information relevant to ongoing intelligence assessments, cave evacuations, surrender procedures, treatment of civilians by Japanese forces. If someone petitions to have her retained as a witness, it could delay repatriation, but it has to be legitimate." Tom took the form. "Thank you, sir." "Merritt," Ellery said as Tom reached the door, "I hope you know what you're doing." "So do I, sir." Over the next week, Tom moved like a man possessed. He filled out forms. He traded favors with clerks in the admin office. He convinced a lieutenant in intelligence that Say's experience during the Okinawa evacuation might provide useful details about civilian handling procedures. It was barely credible, but it was enough. Sae was moved to a witness inquiry list. Her name disappeared from the repatriation manifest. But the price was interviews. She sat in a windowless room with a military policeman, a Red Cross representative, and a translator. They asked her about the caves, about Japanese soldiers, about her family's loyalties, about why she'd been captured, where she'd been taken, what she'd seen. She answered carefully, aware that every word could either save her or condemn her. "Do you have family in Japan?" the MP asked. "Okinawa," she corrected through the translator. "Not Japan." "Do you have relatives who served in the imperial forces?" "No." "Fishermen, farmers." "Why were you in the caves?" "Hiding from the battle." The questions went on for hours. When they finally let her go, she felt hollow, scraped clean. Sergeant Klein cornered Tom outside the quartermaster's depot the following afternoon. "You know what you're doing is insane, right?" Klein said, voice low. "I'm following proper channels, Sergeant." "You're risking your neck for a woman who might not even be allowed to stay in this country. And even if she is, you think the army's going to let you marry her?" You think your family back in Oklahoma is going to welcome an Okinawan girl into their home? Tom met his eyes. That's my problem, Sergeant. Klein shook his head. Your funeral, kid. Through it all, Tom and Say found ways to communicate. Diaz became their intermediary, passing folded scraps of paper through the fence. Say's English improved in fragments. She learned. Tomorrow, wait. Safe, soon. Tom learned. Thank you, scared, hope, yours. They met at the fence most evenings, when the guards changed shifts and the camp's attention turned inward. Tom would bring whatever he could: a piece of fruit, a biscuit, once a pencil so she could practice writing English letters. Say would show him the words she'd learned, pointing at the scraped letters on scrap paper, and Tom would nod. Encouraging, patient. One evening, she touched the parachute cord ring on her thumb and asked, "When?" Tom understood. "I don't know. I'm trying." "I know," she said softly. "I wait." But waiting had limits. The repatriation rumors intensify. Another ship was coming. More names would be added to lists. The war was over. The detention camps were supposed to be temporary. The government wanted to empty them, close the chapter, move on. Tom went to Chaplain Ellery again, this time with Diaz and a stack of forms. They filed a formal petition for marriage. Tom as petitioner, Sai as respondent, supporting statements from the camp doctor noting her improved health, a letter from the Red Cross worker confirming she had no family to return to. They waited 2 weeks. The rejection letter came on a Friday. 1 page, typed impersonal, petition denied. Reason: applicable immigration law does not currently permit entry of Japanese nationals as spouses of U.S. servicemen. Petitioner may resubmit upon change in statute. Tom read it 3 times, standing in the admin building's hallway, before he folded it and put it in his pocket. That evening, he found Say at the fence. He didn't need to say anything. She saw it in his face. "No?" she asked quietly. "No," he said. "Not yet." She nodded, turning the ring on her thumb. "What we do?" Tom pressed his hand against the wire. "We keep trying. Laws change. Policies change. We just have to outlast the paperwork." Say placed her hand opposite his. The chain links between them like a promise and a problem both. "I wait," she said again. "I not leave." "I know," Tom said. "Neither will I." But as he walked back to the barracks that night, he wondered how long they could hold on before the machinery of bureaucracy ground them down to nothing. Winter came to Honolulu, which meant the rains arrived and the gulch turned to red mud. Tom filed a second marriage petition in November 1946. It vanished somewhere between the camp office and SCAP headquarters in Tokyo. No denial, no acknowledgement, just silence. The third petition, filed in March 1947, came back stamped under review. It stayed under review for 8 months. In the meantime, Say survived by inches. Her health improved, slowly, stubbornly. The infirmary released her from the medical rations list, which meant she was strong enough to work. She joined the women's garden detail, a small plot of volcanic dirt where string beans and bitter melon fought their way towards sunlight. The work was hard. Her hands blistered easily, but it gave her something the barracks never could: purpose. The other women taught her things: how to coax vegetables from hostile soil, how to braid her hair so it stayed out of her face during the heat, how to laugh at small absurdities: a guard who sneezed every time he walked past the laundry line, a rooster that had somehow infiltrated the compound and refused to leave. One of the women, an older Issei from Kauai named Mrs. Yamada, took a particular interest in Sai. "You're the one with the soldier boy," she said one afternoon. Not unkindly. Say nodded, embarrassed. "Good," Mrs. Yamada said, patting her hand. "Love is the only thing they can't put a fence around." In the spring of 1948, Tom was transferred back to a post closer to Say's compound. He'd been rotated through 3 different assignments over the past year: Supply Depot in Schofield, a brief stint at Pearl Harbor, then back to Honolulu. Each transfer felt like exile. Each return felt like breathing again. Small kindnesses began appearing. A guard named Private Chen, who rarely spoke, slipped a papaya through the fence one morning while Say was hanging laundry. "From the CO's tree," he muttered, then walked away before she could thank him. The papaya was sweet, sun-warm, impossible. She shared it with Mrs. Yamada and two other women, and they ate it with their fingers, laughing at the juice that ran down their wrists. Chaplain Ellery became their unexpected champion. He collected endorsements like a man building a case for trial. The camp doctor wrote that Say's recovery demonstrated resilience and stability. The Red Cross representative noted she had no family ties requiring repatriation. Even Sergeant Klein, who'd spent 2 years warning Tom away from trouble, signed a statement confirming that Private Merritt had conducted himself within regulations to the best of his ability under difficult circumstances. It was the closest thing to a blessing Klein would ever give. Then, in the summer of 1950, the world shifted. The news came through official channels first, then trickled down through the ranks. Congress had amended the immigration laws. Japanese nationals married to U.S. citizens could now enter the country on a non-quota basis. The door that had been bolted shut for 5 years cracked open just wide enough for people like Say to slip through. Tom heard about it from Diaz, who'd heard it from a clerk in the admin office. He didn't let himself believe it until he saw the memo in writing, printed on official letterhead, stamped and dated. He went straight to Chaplain Ellery's office. "I heard," Ellery said before Tom could speak. "Sit down, we have work to do." They filed the fourth petition together. This time the paperwork moved. Slowly, maddeningly, but it moved. Requests for documentation, verification of service, proof of Say's civilian status, background checks, medical clearances. The camp commander, Colonel Hewitt, called Tom into his office in September. Tom stood at attention, expecting a reprimand. Instead, Hewitt slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. "I'm signing this," Hewitt said. "Letter stating I am not opposed to your marriage petition. I can't endorse it officially. That's above my pay grade, but I can kick it upstairs without objection. Consider it kicked." Tom stared at the letter, barely breathing. "Thank you, sir." Hewitt leaned back in his chair. "Merritt. I've watched you chase this for 4 years. I don't know if you're stubborn or stupid, but I respect the hell out of it. Don't make me regret this." "No, sir." 2 weeks later, Chaplain Ellery pulled Tom aside after evening mess. "We have a date," he said quietly. "November 7th, 10 in the morning, Post Chapel in Honolulu. Bring witnesses." Tom felt the words land like something physical. "It's approved?" "Approved enough. The paperwork's not perfect, but it's sufficient. We're doing this before anyone changes their mind." Tom told Say that night through the fence. She didn't cry. She just stood there, turning the parachute cord ring on her thumb, and nodded. "November 7th, she repeated carefully. "November 7th, Tom confirmed. "I be ready." The morning of November 7th, 1950, arrived gray and wet. Rain drummed on the roof of the small post chapel in Honolulu, turning the world outside the windows into a blur of green and mist. Say wore a borrowed dress, pale blue, slightly too large, hemmed hastily by Mrs. Yamada the night before. Tom wore his dress uniform, buttons polished, hands shaking as he signed the ledger. The ceremony lasted maybe 10 minutes. Chaplain Ellery read from a prayer book. Diaz and Private Chen stood as witnesses. There were no flowers, no music, no reception. Just a room with wooden pews and rain-streaked windows and two people promising to protect each other in a language they were still learning to speak. When Ellery said, "You may kiss the bride," Tom leaned forward carefully, as if Say might disappear if he moved too fast. The kiss was brief, tentative, real. Afterward, they stood on the chapel steps under a shared umbrella, watching the rain. Say looked down at her hand, where the parachute cord ring now sat beside a thin gold band Tom had bought with 2 months' pay. "We marry," she said softly, testing the words. "Yeah," Tom said. "We did." It felt anticlimactic. No trumpets, no transformation, just two people legally bound in a world that had spent 5 years trying to keep them apart. But it was enough. 3 months later, in February 1951, Say received her immigration approval. A single sheet of paper, stamped and signed, granting her entry to the United States mainland as the spouse of a U.S. serviceman. She read it 3 times, sitting on her cot in the barracks before she let herself believe it was real. That evening, she met Tom at the fence one last time. The parachute cord ring and the gold band caught the late sun. "When do you leave?" Tom asked. 2 weeks. Ship to San Francisco, then train. "I'll meet you in Oklahoma," Tom said. "I've got discharge papers coming through. We'll go home together." Say looked at the gulch, the barracks, the wire that had defined her world for 6 years. "Home," she repeated. It was a word she'd lost in a cave on Okinawa, a word Tom was offering her now, fragile and uncertain, on a farm she'd never seen in a place she couldn't imagine. She took it anyway. Say stepped off the train in Vinita, Oklahoma, on a February afternoon so cold it felt like breathing glass. The wind cut through the wool coat an auntie in Honolulu had stitched for her, too thin, made for island winters that never truly bit. Snow lay in gray piles along the platform. The sky was the color of old metal. Tom's mother waited by a truck, arms crossed, face carved from drought, years, and loss. Her name was Dorothy Merritt, and she did not smile when Tom introduced them. "Ma, this is Say, my wife." Dorothy looked Say up and down. The borrowed coat, the careful posture, the eyes that had seen too much. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose you'd better get in the truck before you freeze." The farmhouse was 20 miles outside town, down a dirt road that turned to ice ruts in winter. It was small, wood frame, weathered the same gray as the sky. Tom carried Say's single suitcase inside. Dorothy walked ahead without waiting, boots heavy on the porch steps. Inside smelled like wood smoke and old coffee. Dorothy showed Say the kitchen, the bedroom, the outhouse, everything explained in short, clipped sentences. "Stove's temperamental. Pump freezes sometimes. Chickens need feeding twice a day." "Yes, ma'am," Say said carefully. Dorothy paused, studying her. "You understand English?" "Some. I learn more." "I expect you will," Dorothy said, and walked away. That first month, Say learned what cold really meant. Not the damp chill of Honolulu's rainy season, but a bone-deep cold that made her hands ache and her breath fog inside the house. She learned how to stoke the wood stove, how to keep the pump from freezing, how to move through a space where she was tolerated but not welcomed. In town, it was worse. The grocer served her last, after every other customer had been helped. The woman at the post office wouldn't meet her eyes. At church, which Tom insisted they attend, people nodded politely, then turned away. She heard the whispers, not loud enough to confront but loud enough to cut. Enemy. War bride. Tom's mistake. One afternoon, at the general store, a man in a feed cap looked her up and down and said to his friend, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Shame what some boys brought home from that war." Tom, standing beside her, went very still. "You got something to say, Earl? You say it to my face." The store went quiet. Earl shifted his weight, suddenly less bold. "Didn't mean nothing by it." "Yes, you did, and you'll keep it to yourself from now on." Earl muttered something and left. The clerk rang up their purchase in silence. Outside, Say touched Tom's arm. "You not have to." "Yes, I do," Tom said quietly. "You're my wife. That means something here, even if they don't want to admit it yet." Say planted a garden in March, as soon as the ground thawed enough to turn. She worked the soil with a borrowed spade, planting seeds she'd bought from the general store. Tomatoes, beans, squash. The neighbors watched from a distance. Dorothy watched from the kitchen window, arms crossed, expression unreadable. By April, green shoots appeared. By May, the garden was thriving. Mrs. Patterson, who lived a quarter-mile down the road, appeared one morning with a basket of seed packets. "Thought you might want these," she said, not quite meeting Say's eyes. "Melons. They do well here if you water them right." "Thank you," Say said, surprised. Mrs. Patterson nodded and left quickly, as if kindness were something she needed to deliver before her courage failed. The librarian, Miss Hodges, was next. She was maybe 60, silver-haired, ran the town library with the precision of a field marshal. When Say came in looking for books to improve her English, Miss Hodges didn't hesitate. She pulled primers, children's books, simple novels. "Come back every week," she said. "I'll have more ready." A neighbor boy, maybe 10 years old, appeared at the fence one afternoon while Say was weeding. "My grandpa said, you're from the Pacific," he said. "Is that true?" "Yes." Okinawa. Where's that? Sei tried to explain. An island far away between Japan and Taiwan. The boy listened, fascinated, then asked if she knew how to grow daikon radishes because his grandpa liked them and couldn't find seeds anywhere. I find seeds, Sei promised, and she did, writing to the auntie in Honolulu who'd made her coat, who sent a packet by mail 6 weeks later. Tom worked road crews that summer, laying asphalt under a sun that turned the plains into a skillet. He came home exhausted, sunburned, but steady. In the evenings, he'd sit with Sei on the porch and practice English with her, or she'd teach him Okinawan phrases, small bridges across the language that still divided them. Dorothy thawed slowly, like the pump in winter. She watched Sei work the garden, keep the house, mend Tom's shirts with stitches so small they were nearly invisible. One evening, she appeared in the doorway while Sei was cooking rice. "You're doing that wrong," Dorothy said, not unkindly. "Here, let me show you." It was the first time she had offered to teach rather than correct. By autumn, Sei had proven herself not through words, but through consistency. She showed up, she worked, she didn't complain. The town began to accept her the way stone accepts water, slowly, grain by grain, until one day the shape had changed without anyone quite noticing when. In October, Sai realized she was pregnant. She told Tom first, one evening on the porch, the words careful and uncertain. Tom's face went through a dozen emotions in as many seconds: shock, joy, terror, determination, before landing on a smile so wide it made her laugh. "We're having a baby," he said, as if testing the words. "Yes," Sei said, "in spring, I think." Tom pulled her close, and for a moment the world was just the two of them and the child between them. A future taking root like the garden she'd planted in hostile soil. Dorothy cried when they told her, the first time Sei had seen her cry. "A grandchild," she whispered. "Lord, I didn't think I'd live to see it." The town began to shift after that. Pregnancy had a way of making abstract prejudice concrete. This wasn't just Tom's war bride anymore. This was a mother, a neighbor, someone carrying the next generation. People nodded more, spoke more, asked how she was feeling. But winter came early that year, and with it, the ice. The storm hit in mid-January, 3 weeks before Sei's due date. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 2 hours. Freezing rain coated everything: trees, roads, power lines. By evening, the lights flickered once, twice, then died. The phone line went dead an hour later. Tom tried the truck. The engine turned over, but the wheels spun uselessly on the glazed driveway. The roads were impassable, sheets of ice under falling sleet. Sei's first contraction came at midnight. She gripped the edge of the kitchen table, breathing through the pain, while Tom stoked the wood stove and tried not to panic. Dorothy boiled water, gathered towels, moved with the grim efficiency of someone who'd birthed 3 children in this same house decades ago. "How far apart?" Dorothy asked. 10 minutes, Sei said through clenched teeth. Tom reached for the phone again, uselessly. "I'll drive to town. Get the doctor." "You'll kill yourself on that ice," Dorothy said flatly. "We do this ourselves." But at 2 in the morning, headlights swept across the kitchen window. A truck, moving slowly, chains on the tires, pulled into the yard. Dr. Callahan climbed out, black bag in hand, ice coating his hat and shoulders. He was the same doctor who'd muttered "enemy" under his breath the first time Sei came to his clinic. The man who'd made her wait in a separate room, who'd written her prescriptions without looking at her face. Now he stood in the Merritt's kitchen, shaking ice from his coat, and said, "Someone called about a baby?" Dr. Callahan set his bag on the kitchen table and rolled up his sleeves without ceremony. "How far apart are the contractions?" 7 minutes, Dorothy said, her voice steady despite the chaos outside. Wind rattling the windows, ice ticking against the glass like 1,000 small clocks. The doctor nodded and moved to wash his hands in the basin by the stove. Tom had heated water in every pot they owned, steam rising in the lamplight. The house had no electricity, no phone, no connection to the world beyond the ice-coated roads, just kerosene lanterns casting shadows that danced across the walls. Say lay on the bed in the small bedroom, breathing through another contraction. Her hands gripped the quilt, the one Dorothy had made when Tom was born, faded blue squares patched with white. When the pain passed, she looked up and saw Dr. Callahan in the doorway. Their eyes met. She remembered the clinic, the way he'd turned away, the way he'd muttered under his breath. Enemy, war bride. The words that had cut deeper than any scalpel. He remembered too. She could see it in the way he hesitated, just for a second, before stepping into the room. Mrs. Merritt, he said quietly, I'm going to help you through this. She nodded, unable to speak. The labor stretched through the darkest hours of the night. Tom paced the kitchen, helpless, while Dorothy moved between the bedroom and the stove, boiling more water, bringing clean towels, whispering reassurances that Say barely heard over the roar of her own body. Dr. Callahan worked by the light of 2 kerosene lanterns, his hands steady, his voice calm. You're doing fine, he said during one contraction. Breathe through it. That's right. At 4 in the morning, when the ice had stopped falling and the world outside had gone silent and crystalline, Say's daughter entered the world with a wail that shook the lamplight. Dr. Callahan caught her, cleared her airways, and held her up, tiny, red-faced, furious at the cold. He wrapped her in a clean towel and placed her on Say's chest. Strong lungs, he muttered, almost to himself. Then he said it again, louder, to the room. Strong lungs. It was the kindest thing he'd ever said to her. Dorothy appeared in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. Tom pushed past her, stumbling to the bedside, staring at his daughter as if she were something conjured from prayer and stubbornness both. Say held the baby against her skin, feeling the small heart beat like a hummingbird's wings. The baby's eyes were closed. Her fingers curled into fists no bigger than walnuts. She had Tom's nose and Say's dark hair, already thick and black. She's perfect, Tom whispered, voice breaking. Dr. Callahan washed his hands again, slowly, methodically. When he finished, he stood by the window, looking out at the ice-glazed world. Roads won't be clear until noon at the earliest, he said. I'll stay until then. Make sure there are no complications. Thank you, Tom said. The doctor turned, meeting Tom's eyes, then says, You're welcome. It was the simplest phrase, but it carried weight. An acknowledgement, an apology without words, the beginning of something that might eventually become forgiveness. By mid-morning, the sun broke through the clouds, turning the ice into a field of diamonds. The power stayed out, but the roads began to thaw. Dr. Callahan packed his bag, paused at the door, and looked back at the bed where Say held her sleeping daughter. What are you naming her? He asked. Say and Tom exchanged a glance. They'd discussed this for months, arguing gently over syllables and meanings, trying to find something that honored both their worlds. Emiko, Say said softly. It means blessed child, and Grace Emiko Merritt. Dr. Callahan nodded. That's a good name. He tipped his hat to Dorothy and left, his truck crunching over the icy driveway. Word spread faster than the thaw. By afternoon, Mrs. Patterson appeared with a quilt she'd been working on in secret, pink and yellow squares, stitched with care. The neighbor boy and his grandfather brought a basket of eggs and a hand-carved wooden rattle. Miss Hodges from the library came with a stack of children's books, their spines worn soft from decades of small hands. Even Earl, the man from the general store, showed up with a tin of tea and a mumbled congratulation before retreating quickly to his truck. The house filled with voices, offerings, the quiet hum of a community beginning to shift. Not all at once, not with fanfare, but like ice melting in sunlight. Inevitable, irreversible. That evening, after everyone had gone and the house had settled into silence, Tom sat in the rocking chair by the wood stove, holding Grace against his chest. She slept with her mouth slightly open, her tiny hand curled around his finger. He thought about the gulch at Honouliuli, the red dirt and barbed wire, the moment he'd caught Say as she fell, the words that had tumbled out of him without permission. You're mine now. He'd meant protection, custody of care, a promise to fight every fence, every form, every law that tried to keep them apart. Now, holding his daughter in a farmhouse in Oklahoma while his wife slept in the next room and the wood stove crackled softly, he realized the promise had grown into something larger than either of them. Not just survival, not just love, but a future, messy and uncertain and rooted in soil that had once felt hostile. Grace stirred, made a small sound, settled again. Tom whispered to her in the lamplight, words she couldn't understand but might remember in the way children remember warmth and safety. Your mother crossed an ocean for you. I crossed every rule I could find. And you're here anyway. That makes you the stubbornest person in this family. Behind him, Say laughed softly. He turned. She was awake, propped on pillows, watching them. She your daughter, Say said. Of course she's stubborn. Tom grinned. Fair point. Say held out her arms, and Tom brought Grace to her. Mother and daughter, backlit by kerosene glow, looking like something painted. Fragile and fierce and absolutely real. Dorothy appeared in the doorway with tea, set the cups down quietly, and kissed Say's forehead before leaving them alone. Outside, the ice continued to melt. The power lines would be repaired by morning. The roads would clear. Life would resume its ordinary rhythms. Farm work, town errands, church on Sundays, but something had shifted. A baby born during an ice storm, delivered by a doctor who had once refused to see her mother as human, welcomed by a town that had spent 2 years learning to look past its own fear. Say looked down at Grace, then up at Tom. She be okay here? Tom thought about the garden Say had planted, the neighbors who'd brought gifts, the librarian who'd offered books, the doctor who'd said strong lungs with something close to wonder in his voice. Yeah, he said. She'll be okay. Better than okay. Say nodded, believing him, and pressed her lips to Grace's forehead. The future, fragile and uncertain as it was, felt possible for the first time since she'd knelt in the dirt at Honouliuli, scavenging spilled grain with shaking hands. The wire was gone. The fence had become a memory. What remained was choice, made daily, small and stubborn and strong-lunged as the child sleeping between them. In the summer of 1985, Say and Tom returned to Hawaii for the first time in 34 years. Tom had retired from the county road crew the previous spring, and their children, Grace, now 33 with 2 sons of her own, and Michael, 28, and teaching history at the high school in Vinita, had pooled money for the trip. Go, Grace had said, before it's too late. A park ranger named Kevin, young enough to be their grandson, led them into the Honouliuli Gulch on a bright afternoon that smelled of red dirt and wild grass. Most of the buildings were gone, demolished, reclaimed by the earth, erased by bureaucracy and time. The barbed wire had been pulled up decades ago. Only the foundations remained. Concrete rectangles half buried in weeds, and the guard tower footings crumbling at the edges. Sai stood where the women's barracks had once cast their shadow. The air was hot and still. Mina birds called from the trees. She closed her eyes and heard other sounds. Roll, call at dawn. The clatter of tin cups, women speaking in low voices while hanging laundry on lines that no longer existed. Tom walked slowly to the spot where the quartermaster's hut had stood. He knelt and pressed his palm to the earth, the same red dirt that had been there 40 years ago when a 19-year-old girl had swayed and dropped a tin cup and he'd moved without thinking. This is it, he said quietly. Right here. Say came and stood beside him. She touched his shoulder. Neither spoke for a long time. Kevin, the ranger, kept a respectful distance, giving them space to remember what the landscape had forgotten. On the drive out of the gulch, they stopped at a roadside stand and bought a bag of green papayas. That night, in their hotel room in Honolulu, Say salted one and ate it straight from the bag, tears and laughter mixing on her face. The taste was exactly as she remembered, sharp, bright, alive. History didn't return what it took, but it let you keep what you made afterward. 2 weeks later, they flew to Okinawa. The island had rebuilt itself into something unrecognizable. Highways cut through what had once been farmland. Cities sprawled where villages had stood. Sai hired a driver to take them south, to the hills where her village had clung to the coastline like a barnacle. The hillside was terraced now, modern houses with solar panels and satellite dishes. The caves had been sealed. The beach where her father had mended nets was lined with seawalls and concrete tetrapods. At a community center, a clerk directed them to a memorial stone near the old cemetery. It listed names, the dead, and the missing from the battle. Sei ran her fingers over the carved characters, searching. Her father's name was there, her sister's name, her brother's, her mother's name was not. An old fisherman, mending nets in the shade of a pavilion, heard them asking questions. He approached slowly, squinting at Sai as if trying to place her face in a catalogue of ghosts. Aragusuku, he said. I knew an Aragusuku family before the war. My father, Sai said in Okinawan, the language returning to her tongue like muscle memories. He was a fisherman. Aragusuku Kenji. The old man nodded. I remember him. Good man. Died in the caves, they said. And his wife? Aragusuku Hana? The fisherman frowned, thinking. I heard she survived. After the war, some people left. Went to South America. Peru maybe, or Brazil. There were programs, but I don't know for certain. Saye stood very still, absorbing the words. Her mother might have lived, might have crossed an ocean just as Sei had, to a place with a different language and a different sky. Or she might have died unremarked, uncounted, her name falling through the cracks the way so many had. Grief, Sei realized, could be both a wound and an empty sleeve, something you carried and something that carried nothing at all. Tom took her hand. They stood together at the memorial stone while the fisherman returned to his nets and the sun burned low over the water. Back in Oklahoma, the farmhouse was loud with the grandchildren. Grace's boys, 8 and 10, ran through the yard chasing the chickens. Michael's daughter, barely 3, sat on the porch steps with Sei, learning to shell peas into a bowl. Dorothy had died 5 years earlier, buried beside Tom's father in the churchyard. The farm was smaller now, most of the land leased out, but the garden still grew, and the kitchen still smelled like wood smoke and coffee. Tom died on a Tuesday morning in April, under the quilt Sei had pieced together from scraps. Cloth diapers Grace had worn, work shirts Tom had mended 100 times, a square of parachute silk she'd kept hidden in a drawer for 40 years. He went peacefully in his sleep, his hand resting on hers. The funeral was crowded. Neighbors, co-workers, people from church, the librarian, now ancient and frail, who taught Sei to read English. Dr. Callahan's son came, a doctor himself now, and told Sei his father had spoken of her often in his last years. He said your daughter had the strongest lungs he had ever heard, the son said, smiling. He was proud to have delivered her. Chaplain Ellery came too, older and slower, leaning on a cane. He read from the ledger where their marriage had been recorded in 1950. The ink faded but still legible. Thomas James Merritt and Sei Aragusuku, he read aloud. Married November 7th, 1950. Honolulu, territory of Hawaii. He looked up at the gathered crowd. Some promises, he said, are kept against all odds. This was one of them. After everyone went home, after the casseroles had been delivered and the sympathy cards stacked on the table, Sei sat on the porch alone. The sun was setting, painting the fields gold and red. A thunderhead climbed the horizon, distant and slow. She heard Tom's voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside her. You're mine now. 3 words, reckless and raw, spoken 40 years ago in a gulch where barbed wire divided the world into boxes. Words that had sounded like conquest but meant custody. Words that had survived bureaucracy, prejudice, winter, loss, and time. Sai twisted the gold band on her finger, the parachute cord ring long since retired to a small box on her dresser, and whispered into the evening air, Anata mo watashi no. You are mine too. The wind carried the words across the fields. Past the garden where tomatoes were just beginning to ripen, past the fence where the neighbor boy, now a grandfather himself, waved from his porch. Inside the house, Grace was making tea. Michael was reading to his daughter from one of the books Miss Hodges had given Sei decades ago. The grandchildren were arguing cheerfully about whose turn it was to feed the chickens. A life built from a promise made at a fence. A family grown from a single act of compassion behind wire. Sei closed her eyes and felt Tom beside her. Not gone, just transformed into memory and legacy and the stubborn roots of love that refused to be pulled up by war or policy or fear. The storm on the horizon moved closer, thunder rolling low across the plains. Sei stood, walked inside, and closed the door against the coming rain. Behind her, the porch light flickered on, a small beacon in the gathering dark, marking a place where a fisherman's daughter and a farm boy had dared to believe that belonging could be chosen, that fences could become thresholds, and that 3 reckless words could outlast everything the world threw against them. You're mine now? Anatama watashi? No, a covenant, spoken twice, across 40 years and 2 languages and an ocean of wire. Kept. If this story connected with you, you'll love what's coming in our next video. Make sure you're subscribed.